Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here for this panel celebrating Rare Disease Day. For those who aren't familiar with the day, it's on the 28th of February this year. Sometimes it's on the 29th, but it's a really important day as a company like Sono that works in genetics and cell and gene therapy. But it's also important to recognize that rare diseases take many forms. And actually, I think everybody on the call has both a professional and a personal connection to the space. So we're going to cover what it means to all of us to be working in the rare disease community, and then also some ideas and perspectives we have on how biotech and cell and gene therapy and precision medicine more broadly can better serve the community. So I'm really excited to be here with this amazing group. And I'm going to actually ask everybody to just start by introducing themselves with what Rare Disease Day means to you personally and what you feel is most important and urgent in the rare disease space right now. And of course, talk a little bit about what you're doing professionally and personally. Jimmy, I see you're unmuted, so I'm going to start with you on this one, and we'll go around the horn.
Good to be here. So what Rare Disease Day means to me, actually, I don't like Rare Disease Day. The same reason I don't like Black History Month in the US or February, and it's the same reason I don't like Valentine's Day. I get why they exist, particularly rare disease. It's unfortunate we've gotten to a position where we need to take a day to recognize people that are suffering from rare diseases. It's sad. I wish we lived in a world where every disease has the same attention, regardless of the size of the patient population. I suffer, well, not anymore. I had a disease, and technically I still have it, called sickle cell disease. I was diagnosed at birth, and here in the US it's considered a rare disease, but where the patient burden actually lies, it's the fastest growing genetic disorder in the world. It's sickle cell disease. I was fortunate enough to actually participate in a CRISPR-based gene therapy about 6 years ago that completely transformed my life. And I kind of went public with my story, excited about this therapy that one day we're all going to get. I thought everyone would get access to it. And I had come to realize that, no, I'm just an extremely lucky individual that got this $2.3 million therapy for free. And now my work, actually, I think it's my whole life, is going to be centered around making sure anyone who wants a gene therapy for sickle cell disease has the ability to get one.
Amazing, Jimmy. Thank you. That is an incredible perspective. Rachel, I'm going to ask you to go next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually love that, Jimmy. You know, I would love for us to not need a Rare Disease Awareness Day, to be honest, because very similar to you, Rare Disease Day to me means the acknowledgement that, you know, rare disease is a misnomer actually entirely, because globally it's rare disease collectively. There are so many different subtypes, of course. Well over 10,000 defined now, but at the same time, millions of people are impacted by rare disease. And actually the WHO resolution last year really recognized that it's a global crisis. So for me, Rare Disease Day is really about recognizing that and thinking about these populations, not as individual small pockets of patients or one patient here or one patient there, but thinking about the strategies we need to innovate and accelerate clinical trials and products like the CRISPR-based therapy Jimmy mentioned to market. Now, I work in the clinical research space. I work in the industry supporting biotech and pharma clients to kind of take these products through that process and eventually get to market, be commercialized and priced at, you know, crazy amounts. But we do need that investment into the market. So for me, that's what it represents. It's equity, accessibility. You know, the $1 million price tags are just not accessible and affordable. So there's more we need to do. We need to look at this as not what's happening in the US, not what's happening in the UK where I'm based, but what is happening on the global stage and how can we take a global approach to this.
Amazing. Thank you, Rachel. We're definitely going to hit that theme, I think, between both you and Jimmy's experience. Lindsey, how about from your perspective?
Yeah, well, I share the sentiment. I think if you've lived rare or you've cared for someone with rare, it's something that affects you every day, if not every minute of every day. But I do think it's a great moment to pause and to reflect on where we've come from and what comes next. And I do think there's an opportunity to take the space to really think about what would move the needle forward. To Rachel's point, rare disease is not all that rare. There are a lot of people who are navigating a diagnosis, and I think there are some exciting breakthroughs that are happening in science right now that will allow us to really tackle these more holistically instead of one at a time. So I think there are really interesting innovations, and I'm excited to be part of that and working in the research and patient engagement space. On the personal side, it's also Rona's half birthday. So Rona was my daughter who died from a rare disease about 2.5 years ago. And so for me, it's a really good moment to think about recognizing and celebrating the people behind the diagnosis and making sure that we're remembering these are individuals who have very full lives and lots of people who care about them, who want to be living life to the fullest. And so when we think about treatments and we think about what comes next on the science front, also making sure that we're celebrating and recognizing the things that make our lives worth living and continuing to keep joy at the forefront.
Amazing. Thank you. I'll probably round out here before we go into, we're going to try to cover 4 or 5 questions in this time that cover span of lived experience that we all bring and how we can use that to influence drug development, advanced therapies, how we balance realism and hope, and some of the really important topics here. My lens on this is I got into this space because I worked primarily as a researcher focused on genetic diagnostics in rare and ultra rare diseases. And that caused me to start Sano, where we focus on bringing diagnostics to as many people as possible with these conditions and helping them connect to trials. And unfortunately, I had a personal experience while I've been building the company that I lost one of my daughters to an ultra rare disease, twin transfusion syndrome. And that was almost like a wake up call moment for me, where I was able to much more viscerally connect the science to actually what matters to people. And it was kind of a yin and yang moment for me, because my other daughter, her twin Raya, is healthy. She's happy. She's still with us. And that's thanks to amazing science and breakthroughs that have been made. But at the same time, we lost her sister because of breakthroughs that haven't been made yet, and missed opportunities in the research field and in medicine more broadly. So I like you all, it's a challenging day for me. We have also a day every year called Hazel Day, where we celebrate and think about her life. But Jimmy, I kind of share your perspective on that a little bit, and I guess yours too, Lindsey. There's like that day, it really means a lot to me, but I also want to make sure that I think about her every day and not just on the one day. So with that in mind, I want to get you all's perspectives as we think about advanced therapies, which I think everybody has had experience with here. How do we balance the hope and the opportunity and the breakthroughs? Jimmy, I think you're living experience of this, with some of the realities of the price point, the complications for families to take part in these trials. I want to hear from you all how you think we should be approaching that today. And Rachel, I'll start with you. What's your perspective, having worked on a number of these programs, on how we balance the hope and the realism here with some of the realities of how hard it is to actually develop these therapies for families?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are multiple ways I could go with answering this. I mean, we could talk about regulatory and national and international incentives to support with research funding in this space, so that the cost of the research potentially comes down. You know, if there's investment made, then we can bring the price of these trials down, and then we don't necessarily have to have such higher price point by the time we're getting to market. I think as well, you know, from a payer perspective, I could talk about that. It's really hard to get a cost-adjusted model. And by cost-adjusted, I mean, you know, when you're taking a medicine for diabetes on a regular basis, or one of these GLP-1s that, you know, are relatively high cost, but, you know, there's a constant stream of this is the money that's kind of going back into them. when he's talking about a gene therapy, you're potentially talking, in most cases, we're hoping one and done. So, and in really small populations. So for companies to be incentivized to invest in this space, we need to have some kind of return on investment. And that's a horrible and sort of icky thing to say. I don't, but it's the reality. If you aren't going to be able to get, R&D spend back to then invest in the next product and the next big thing, and to pay your investors back who have who've trusted you from the time that you've gone with your science to them and said, please fund this, then the whole system would come and grinding to a halt. So I think there's a lot that we could do at a policy level, at a regulatory level, national and international initiatives to bring those costs down so that we don't have to have quite so expensive therapies when they're getting through. But then I could also answer this from a hope perspective. It's these therapies don't work for everybody. They are a magic bullet in some cases. Jimmy's a shining example of that, but they are not a magic bullet for every case. And we can think about some of the gene therapies in Duchenne's as an example. It gives you a milder phenotype, but it's still ultimately, you still have the condition, you still have muscular dystrophy. So we need to temper those expectations. We need to think about how patients can access it post-approval as well. I've got a beautiful colleague, a girl called Kvanzo, whose daughter's got Rett syndrome, and she's based in Georgia in Europe. And she knows that her daughter is unlikely to be able to access the 2 gene therapies that are being developed at the moment, except through maybe some specialized compassionate use program or something like that. So I think going back to my original answer, which was about globalization, I think if we take a more global approach and think of, when we're opening trials, how do we access as much of the population as possible to get the data we need so that it's safe and effective and comes through? And then how do we incentivize these companies to bring that cost down by putting in effective infrastructure?
Jimi, I'd love to have your perspective on this. It sounds like you lived a little bit of an arc where obviously you experienced the hope and magic of some of these therapies firsthand, but also saw the broader societal implications of that. What have you learned through this process, and what are you thinking about right now?
Yeah, I want to comment on something Rachel said, and I don't think it's icky at all to have a capitalistic point of view about solving the issue. It's the system that we're in. We just have to cut out the greed. That's what the problem is. And for me, for what I've seen as a patient who's transitioning into biotech himself, I think the system's broken. Unfortunately, look, even 2 weeks ago, the whole system, from the drug development and here in the US to our healthcare system, I think we need to stop putting patients at the tail end of the chain and put them actually in front. That's actually what I'm doing here. I'm at a company called NV Therapeutics that creates non-viral gene therapies for certain indications. And what my job here is to give lived experience while the research and development is going on. We need to learn how to research and develop accessibility while we're researching and developing the science. Imagine having a patient yapping in your ear all day as a scientist while you're creating a therapy. I don't see a better way for you to make sure that this therapy that you are creating will one day get to a patient. We don't do that anymore. I don't know if we've done that at all. We create these therapies, and then at the back end of the therapy, we realize that we haven't actually figured out a way to get the therapy to patients. That's why, if you see, there's so many new businesses that are centered around repurposing shelved advanced therapies, because we've been doing it for decades, and there's so many shelved therapies on the market now, that businesses on the market now that are figuring out ways to bring these shelved therapies to patients. I think we just have to, at the end of the day, think what we're doing. We're making therapy for patients. And as crazy as it sounds, we have to think of patients as almost products, or the end users of our products, and figure out how we can get, that's the goal for the investors, is to make sure that they get their return on their investment. And they don't get that return on investment if patients are not getting access to the drugs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We've seen so many of these therapies fail commercially, right? Because they miss something that they could have gotten right by having patients closer to the start. Lindsey, what do you have reactions to that, but also thoughts more broadly on how we can balance promise and realism with these advanced therapies?
Yeah, I think pulling on both what Jimmy and Rachel said, I think Jimmy, absolutely. I'm all for patient engagement early and often. And I do think the rare space gives really strong examples of where that's been done successfully. I think Farah, for example, Ron Bartek, the work that they've been doing on getting data together. I mean, part of the thing with rare, one of the big obstacles we need to overcome really is community readiness. Are there enough people in one place? Are researchers going to be able to get access to the data they need to identify the pathways to really study the populations? And so I do think that the rare disease community and the smaller foundations that are really research focused have helped to accelerate some of these treatments, and things like genetic testing have unlocked obviously new pathways to be exploring, but without access to the patients, none of that would have happened. And so there's a huge kudos to the organizations that are out there really bringing people together, creating these registries, making things happen. To Rachel's point on hope, I struggle with hope. Prior to Rona's diagnosis, I would get so frustrated when an IRB would say, like, you cannot say potential cure, right? You have to say potential treatment option. But after our experience, I see why. And that is because what we're really promising is the opportunity potentially to do something in the face of not having anything else to do. And I think in that instance, then the existence of a study, the existence of a trial, the existence of a gene therapy becomes inherently coercive. So when we're in the research space and we're talking about protocols and we're looking at study design, any barrier to entry becomes too high because of the stress that families are already under. And then we're having discussions, or I've been a part of discussions where we're talking about, is reimbursement coercive? Are travel stipends coercive? And the answer is no, the therapy is coercive. So how do we then leverage things like reimbursements, like travel stipends, like caregiver time reimbursements for the amount and the intensity that is caregiving in a gene therapy situation? How can we leverage those to accelerate science, to make it easier on the families who are participating in research? And then beyond that, I think in these instances, informed consent becomes less about explaining the risks and the benefits and more about really helping families understand what's coming at them and really understanding gene therapy is a one and done. And in a research situation, you might not get the opportunity to participate in another trial. So you really need to have a conversation to understand the likely outcomes or potential outcomes for your instance. And then maintaining that communication, because I'm sure Jimmy knows better than all of us, and Rona was also in a transplant setting. So that time of isolation is significant, and the isolation in and of itself is put in place because of the risks that are associated after the treatment is received. And so how do we keep those lines of communication open and moving throughout the duration of that whole study experience? I think sometimes we treat an ICF like a finish line, and it's really the start of a dialogue, and we need to be thinking and approaching these processes that way.
One of the things that I feel like we see over and over again is we as a community fail to engage deeply enough and early enough, and then you get months or years down the line and it becomes too late to change, either because all the forces of getting it approved in every country have taken hold, or budgets are locked, and all these practical business reasons come in that say it would have been great if we knew that 2 years ago, but we didn't, and so the train's left the station. What do you think we can do to bring the lived experiences much closer to the beginning of the process? What have you all learned about that? Because I think most people would agree with the statement, but it becomes extremely hard to actually believe that in practice because so few people actually really live it in the most radical way that I think you all are thinking about it. So anyone who has a thought on this, please jump in. I won't call on anybody on this. I'll just let you jump in. I see Jimmy's unmuting, so you go for it.
I think it comes down to the biotech company or the drug developer on what they value lived experience. What's that? How do you value lived experience? And you see that varies across the board. I've been in ad boards where they claim they value lived experience and they're bringing patients in and essentially checking a box, if I'm completely honest. And then you've seen other companies that, yeah, lived experience is extremely valuable to me. And the drug that we're developing here, that I want you as often as possible in the beginning of the process as opposed to the end. I think it's going to really vary across the board, but I think the goal should be to, particularly for patient advocates, is to really stand up and speak that my lived experience is actually sometimes, or if not all the time, more valuable than your degree. And because I lived the disease while you studied it, I lived it. And that's what I try to do as much. And a lot of people don't like that, but I know for a fact that I've seen that really, if put together with actually coming up with a drug, when you value lived experience and you put it at the forefront, the drug that comes out on the other end actually has a better chance to get into patients than when you do the opposite.
Yeah, we've seen so many examples of that. And I actually, this is kind of linked to something you said earlier, Jimmy, but I had a colleague at a large pharma who just joined as their head of patient engagement and advocacy turn to me and say, this is the most selfish industry I've ever worked in. Any other industry, if you're developing a toy for a child, you have all of these focus groups at every stage. What material should it be? What color should it be? What noises should it make? Should it flash? All of these things. And at every single stage, every iteration, they get these focus groups and they do it again and again and again. And yet we haven't got into the habit of that. We often see our end users as the people who are going to pay for and buy and prescribe, but actually that's not the case at all. So I think we need to get out of this loop of thinking like that. We need to change the way we are thinking, and that is happening. I have seen it. It's really promising. When I first got into the industry nearly 2 decades ago, I felt very alone in my voice and sort of saying we need to include patients, and a lot of the time we were hearing, oh, but we can't know who our patients are. And in rare disease, we know that's really hard to do. That's really tough to do. So we're not going to do it. I think now, because one, we are required to do it, so that has definitely helped. But to your point, Jimmy, I've seen it used too many times as tick box, or we've had an ad board. Great. Well, what came out of that ad board? Did you respond with, we took these into considerations, or we can't do this because of this? Did you share anything back? When did you meet with them again? And that's a kind of blank faces type approach. But I am seeing improvements in that space. So I think we are shifting slowly in that direction. Would love for it to be a little less slow, honestly, and move much more quickly. But to your point, we've got so many examples of therapies that have failed their primary endpoint because we've taken something that is the norm, and we've just applied it to a clinical trial without really speaking to families about what's going to genuinely make the difference for you, because it might not be it might not be sort of insulin dependence in these rare conditions that are rare kind of endocrine conditions, because it's well managed and they've got opportunity from the diabetes space. But actually some of these other symptoms that they might have is disrupting their sleep, and it's causing behavioural challenges, and that's huge for families. So really speaking to those families right early on in the research space is so important. And like I said, I'm seeing companies do it. I do think that we have to put a bit of a pause and a bit of a hesitation on these scientists who get super excited about what they're doing and what their product is showing in the preclinical space, and sort of say, but is this what the patients are looking for? Let's just pause. Are they looking for that? Let's go and speak to them. Let's just have a really small, really low cost focus group. Let's just have that conversation. And I don't think the onus should be on the advocacy groups. I think the onus should be on the drug developers.
Lindsey, I'd love your perspective on this, because I think you've taken also a very holistic view that's not just like, hey, how do we design a good trial, but how do we think about the whole experience? I'd love to have you weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when Rachel was speaking, I was thinking back to grad school. I got my MPH, and we had a lecture where one of the professors was talking about a journal club that she'd been a part of. And the author was so excited because it was the tiniest p-value they had ever seen. And they were just focusing on this tiny little p-value. And she said, okay, well, what's the clinical difference? And there was no meaningful clinical difference, but it was the tiniest little p-value. And I feel like that encompasses this conversation a bit, where you think about what actually matters to the patient. And I do think that I hold this to be true, that recruitment challenges are locked in at the moment of protocol lock. And so if you are not engaging families prior to that point, I don't think that I think you might struggle with recruitment. And so it's not a marketing thing, it's a design thing. So then that necessitates that engagement early and often, defining endpoints that matter to the end user. You're right, Rachel, we treat people who will be taking the medication as a given that they'll take the medication. And sometimes that might be true, but not always. And those side effects and the impacts on daily living matter. But I also think when you get into a research setting and when you're talking about rare, the reality is that still to this day, 30% of children with a rare disease will die before their 5th birthday. I was lucky to get Rona until 2 weeks after her 6th, but you are looking at moments and families who might not ever leave the hospital with their child, or who might have a child who requires really high and intense levels of caring. So they might be in a long-term care facility, or in our case, we spent 1 out of every 12 days of Rona's life in the hospital. And so creating opportunities for families to have good days, for families to have moments that matter, magical moments within your protocol. And there are so many ways to do that. There are hundreds of organizations that are working to do that, to bring joy to children. I think, too, we index a lot on avoiding complications and making decisions about what families are and are not allowed to do based on the complications that might exist as a result of that. In our instance, we weren't allowed to bring Rona outside of her room because of a fear of infection. We had a couple of providers that let us sneak her outside, and her white count came back. So we took her outside for 10 minutes a day. We took every available precaution. She got a white count. Someone found out about it. They shut it down. We never got the white count back again. And so having those moments where kids just get to be kids, or not even just children, where people get to be people and be around the people and the activities that give their life meaning, is really critical. And I don't think we do that. And someone might say, well, that's not the job of a protocol. And it's not the job of a protocol, but I think it is the job of the research team. And so creating more space for that, really making sure, again, that families understand what's happening, watching how we talk about people, finding ways to make things easier for families, and engaging, again, people with lived experience. I say this all the time, Jimmy, as equal partners, expertise and lived experience and expertise in science in this space in particular hold equal weight. And it's really critical that we create space for that.
I want to get you all's perspective on the role that regulators and other I guess market participants in this have to play, because you've all pointed out the fact that we have a lot of different stakeholders in this, and the patient is very often the person who is the end consumer. But between the new therapy and the patient is a regulator who has to sign off on the study plan, is a payer, is a healthcare provider that may need to be involved to recommend it or help get reimbursed. And so we have this really challenging gauntlet to run through. And often you made the point that I completely agree with, Lindsey, about protocols being destiny in many of these cases. And that is often because they have to hit a specific endpoint, and it can take years and tons of money to validate a new endpoint. I want to have you all's perspective on how the regulatory process it influences this, and what we could do maybe there to influence change to make rare disease programs faster run, easier to run, better on patients, and at least remove that variable or turn that to a positive variable in the equation rather than what can be a challenging variable, I think, in many cases. Who wants to take that one first?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll come in on that. I would say, firstly, I want to acknowledge that without the Orphan Drug Act in the US, we wouldn't be where we are today. That's a fact. We wouldn't be where we are with the 5% of rare diseases that have a treatment available. We wouldn't be there today. And I do think there is a role for regulators and access payers and HTAs to really support and help this through. The risk benefit that we look at every single time we assess one of these drugs is very, very different for a fatal rare condition that, is going to take the life of a child before their 5th birthday, to someone who had, like myself, I have a rare condition who is relatively well controlled, that's a very different risk benefit assessment, and that needs to be taken into account by regulators. Having said that, regulators are also need to be risk averse. They're going to be risk averse. If you put in front of them the first interaction that you have with them, gold standard double blind placebo controlled trial, they're going to say yes to that. So again, I think the onus almost falls on drug developers to push the envelope, to push the regulators to question whether that is the right or the most appropriate study design. It's the most scientifically strong, but is it pragmatic and realistic in real life? Is it going to, of course, it might take 20 years to run, but it will get you the most beautiful data set you've ever seen. But at the same time, 20 years is too long for most of these patients. So I think it's on us to kind of really push that envelope and go, okay, well, we need to do something else. We need to come up with adaptive trial design with external control arms. We need to be having something that's shorter. We've had challenges with the accelerated approval pathway, which is a fantastic initiative, but is yet yielding, multiple CRLs or complete response letters from FDA at the moment in the rare space saying, no, you need more data. So I do think there's a balance between that they don't want to be they want to be risk averse, so they don't want to take those risks. But if we push them to at least come meet us somewhere in the middle, and then we can say yes, this worked, and then we can deploy it again and again and again and show it worked, and then there can be guidance, and then we can change the regulatory framework. Same with payers. Payers think differently. They actually think about quality of life and healthcare utilization. The FDA is not that interested in healthcare utilization. The MHRA is not that interested in healthcare utilization, but payers are, because they fund these hospital visits. So they want to know that if you're reducing those down, that's great. So this is where, I actually think the payer landscape is quite different, but they don't understand. There's no gold standard model at the moment to bring in these high cost treatments and appropriately deploy them into the commercial market. There just isn't. There's some attempts, but I do think in that case, I think the payers need to come up with something a bit more innovative. But again, it's on us to push them.
Lindsey, Jimmy, any thoughts to add to that?
I'll give you a story from my personal journey, getting an advanced therapy and having to deal with regulators. So I had a CRISPR-based gene therapy at the age of 35. And what we've come to realize through the clinical trial, which is exactly what a clinical trial is for, is adult patients that get some type of advanced therapy, be it gene therapy or cell therapy. If you're an adult getting a therapy, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have struggle post-transplant. That's why it's very important that we, particularly gene therapy, we stop using that moniker, a one-time treatment, because I think Lindsey actually alluded to this, that the work actually begins, most of the work actually begins post-transplant. Now, did regulators see this coming? I'm not sure, but what I've come to realize that from engaging to try and solve this issue that we're facing, adult patients in particular are facing post-transplant, this mental health issue, is no one was aware of it, or at least I thought no one was aware of it. So it's actually now patient communities that are doing the work to actually make sure that there's a safety net. So when an adult patient comes to an advanced therapy, there's actually some type of support there waiting for that patient when he or she would eventually face these mental health struggles. I'm not sure why regulators or the drug developer themselves didn't know this would be an issue, even though it's been well documented. You could see this actually with HIV as well. A lot of them who in the 90s who got their therapy quite late in life actually suffered from serious identity crisis post-treatment. So we've seen these in different communities. And basically what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's fair to task patients, even though we'll do the job, to put Humpty Dumpty together when we weren't the one who pushed him off the wall. So I would like to see regulators to be a lot more proactive instead of reactive. And almost the same way we've kind of talked the last 20 minutes about embedding a patient in the drug development process, maybe that might be even a good idea that regulators are talking to patients early on, trying to learn their experience. So when these therapies are eventually pitched to them by biotechs and drug developers, they have an idea what to expect on the back end.
I think the PFDD process, the patient-focused drug development, is a really important tool here of bringing those communities together, weighing in early. I was at a meeting at the FDA a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about leveraging new trial types. And this was in the context of leveraging rare disease frameworks for neonatal research, which is, believe it or not, even less studied and harder to find treatments. Nothing is approved. And so really thinking about how we might use innovative treatments, innovative technologies, innovative study design to get to our endpoints. I'll go back to the previous comment I made around data and having the registries. I think that's really critical. But we are the most biohacked we have ever been. Like everyone has, not everyone, but everyone has access in theory, at least through a study, to wearable devices. We have at-home monitoring systems. We have the ability to order mobile phlebotomy and to collect samples that way. And I think there are so many ways we could get to data and get to really understanding endpoints and data that is collected remotely or at home in a way that is sufficiently structured to meet scientific criteria that we could reduce burden and drive things forward. And so I do think rare diseases in particular give us an opportunity to leverage these new technologies, to collect the data that's meaningful that will get us to the endpoints, and to really pave the way for what we're going to start seeing, I think, in other conditions as well. I think maybe we got the DCT thing wrong before. It's sort of had its moment. It seems to be abating a bit, but I still think there's a role for remote monitoring, data surveillance. In the United States, we've done enough structuring on our EHRs to really start thinking about what does long-term follow-up look like with remote monitoring of electronic health records. And in rare, if we're going to be approving things after a phase 2B, for example, instead of going for the full phase 3, that monitoring becomes really critical. So yeah, that's what I would add to that.
Yeah, super. I want to wrap up here with each of you all's perspectives on if we're sitting here having this conversation in 5 years and one or two things change from your perspective. What do you think those can be? And it doesn't need to be a tectonic shift in the whole industry, especially if you have something like Jimi, you're very focused on how do we make sure that access gets outside of the very small number of people in countries who can afford these therapies. So like maybe we can start there. I want to hear what you're working on that you think if you're successful and the people you work with can move the needle, what does that look like and what does success look like to increase access or to improve the way we develop these therapies in a more scalable and sustainable way. So maybe I'll start with you, Jimi. If we're sitting here in 5 years, what would you consider to be a success?
I think for me, I'll speak from the point of view with advanced therapies for sickle cell disease. I think we really need to almost kind of change the goalpost. So one of the things that the industry as a whole has been working towards is moving this gene therapy that we have right now in the ex vivo format to in vivo. That's probably going to be the best way to scale people or scale this treatment to get it to regions where we don't have the logistical headaches of manufacturing and collection. And I think what I would consider a success is one, first of all, we need to change our idea of what a success looks like. For the last 5 years, when we've all been talking about this idea of pushing in vivo gene therapy forward, we've all been thinking of it as like a one-time infusion. You just get dosed once. And as the science is moving along and we're realizing how incredibly difficult it is to target stem cells, we might have to change the goalpost and say maybe it's actually not a one-time dose. You might have to be dosed once, twice, maybe even 3 times. That would be my goal. I don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. So I want as many biotechs as possible that are working on in vivo gene therapy to be comfortable shifting that goalpost and making sure that the end goal is still getting something to patient. Right? When I tell my story, I tell people that because I was the fourth person to get a gene therapy in the US for sickle cell disease, and there were only three people ahead of me with very limited data when gene therapy was still considered extremely novel. And everyone asked me, weren't you terrified? And I'm in a 15-year follow-up. What if you get an off-target edit and this happens and that happens? I'm like, I don't really care. If I have 3 years to just live a normal life, that's worth it for me. And if the therapy ends up killing me 5, 6 years after, I'm completely happy with that. I think people forget that patients are just desperate to be normal. So if you can get something that would give a patient 10, even less than that, just years of feeling normal and not being in pain, I think for me that would be considered a success.
Rachel, I'm going to go to you next on this. 5 years from now, what does success feel like to you?
If 5 years from now we are having the same conversation, I will have lost all of my hair and aged considerably. Um, so I think 5 years from now, I actually love what the phrase Jimmy used, not sacrificing the good for the perfect. I think if we all take that approach, regulators and payers included in that, I think we would be better served as a community. So for me, what I would like to see in 5 years from now is these kind of more platform and umbrella type approaches. I work a lot in antisense oligonucleotides as well. We're working on in the UK, we're working on a program where we might be able to give each individual ultra rare patient an ASO if they're ASO amenable. And we've actually been able to get a protocol through recently and approved by the MHRA, which is allowing us to do that across multiple different diseases. So it's not the same ASO for every, but it's the same concept, it's the same principle, it's the same, similar safety, same chemistry backbone, all of these things. I think I would like to see that on a larger scale. So that, again, we're not talking about these pockets of 20 patients here, 10 patients there. We're talking about a larger group, and we can prove that the technology works in that group, and then more patients can benefit ultimately and faster. So I would love to see, more regulatory and payer acceptance of those types of approaches. We need a payer model to go with that. It won't work if we just get approval and we don't have a payer model. But that in 5 years' time, if we're even, 5, 10 steps down the road, I would be so excited for that.
I totally agree. Lindsey, you get the honor of finishing us out here with your 5-year vision.
No pressure. But I think the first place to start is more than 5% of our conditions having an approved treatment. And I think there are a few things we need to do to get there. Looking at pathways is important. I think a lot about Rona's experience. Aplastic anemia is more closely related to forms of ataxia that have apoptosis as their key mechanism of action than it does the blood disorders that it is currently grouped into for treatments today. And so surprise, one of the things, I guess shouldn't be a surprise, that one of the things her research team learned from her and from others is that the treatment that they used for her is much less effective in kids with aplastic anemia than it is in kids with other hematological conditions. So I think really understanding disease etiology, causal pathways, and then targeting treatments around that. I also think leveraging incentives that encourage teams to pursue approvals beyond their original pathway. I do think that was a knock-on effect, an unintended consequence of reducing drug costs in the United States is that we're seeing less than investment in secondary and tertiary approvals. The rare priority voucher, that's exciting that got reapproved a couple of weeks ago. And I think that's a really nice incentive there, but I'd love to see a similar mechanism for those additional approvals coming through, or maybe grouping rare disease approvals into one condition and allowing that to go through, because I do think that's going to be a blocker at some point in time. And to the point, the payers also need to be on board. We struggled. We actually were denied treatment by the private insurance because they were concerned about the additional costs that Jimmy alluded to with treatment starting after transplant. And so we did need to move to a public insurance in order to have our coverage there. So, regulatory approvals, more disease incentives, more incentives for better treatments for rare disease, and the payer component. But then I really want to push us as an industry to focus on the people. behind the diagnosis. For me, what's exciting to think about is what comes after we've talked about the cure. What are the next wave of endpoints that start to matter? What are the next things that we're considering? What does that next wave of treatment look like that add to quality of life, not just quantity of life? And so if we are 5 years from now starting to think about that in some of these conditions, what does quality of life look like after we've secured a cure? That would be wildly exciting.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I just want to close out by saying thank you to all of you for not just sharing your time with us for this hour to talk about your work and what you do, but for all the days, minutes, and hours in between every rare disease day that we have that you dedicate yourselves to this field. So thank you very much. Thanks, as always, for tuning into the Genetics Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, the best way you can support the show is by sharing it with a friend or colleague who might find it interesting as well. We'd also really appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps other people discover the show when they're searching for content on genetics, precision medicine, or biotech. We always want to hear from you as well. If you have feedback or questions or want to be featured on the show, you can email us at podcast@sonogenetics.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Patrick Short. You can find us as well, Sonogenetics, on LinkedIn, or reach out on Instagram at The Genetics Podcast. And finally, a special thank you to the team behind the show who makes this possible. Joy Ismail produces and manages the show. Jane Reddy Webster keeps us organized, and James Pierce from Selective Frequencies for his expert audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.